At a crowded warehouse in Chicago, a man named David Langston was on the verge of something he had waited over a decade to achieve. After 12 long years of backbreaking work, enduring silent prejudice, and being overlooked time and again, today was his chance. One crucial meeting could change everything. A promotion to warehouse supervisor, a steady salary, benefits to cover his mother's mounting medical bills. Finally, a step toward the life he had always dreamed of. But David Langston never made it to that meeting. It was raining that morning. A cold, relentless rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of Northern Hall Logistics, blurring the edges of David's focus as he reviewed the day's checklist. It was just another day of loading crates, ticking off inventories, and directing traffic on the dock. But not for David. Not today. David had woken up earlier than usual, laying out his cleanest uniform, making sure his boots were polished, and his name tagged E. Langston was clearly visible despite its fraying edges. It was his big day. Finally, at exactly 10 o'clock, he was scheduled to meet with the corporate executives who would decide whether he would move up from the cold, noisy docks to the quiet, warm offices upstairs. He had earned this opportunity. 12 years of relentless work. 12 years of showing up early, staying late, and doing twice as much as anyone asked of him. 12 years of keeping his head down, working harder than those who advanced past him, often because of who they knew rather than what they did. Today, it was supposed to be his turn. But at 9:45 a.m., just 15 minutes before his meeting, David saw something that made his heart clench. An elderly woman, frail and trembling, stood by the customer pickup counter. The rain had soaked her thin gray coat, and she looked lost and unsteady. She was clutching a damp receipt in one hand, her other hand gripping her side. Her steps wobbled dangerously as she scanned the area for help. David glanced at the warehouse clock. He was cutting it close. But as he turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind knocked a wet floor sign into the woman's path. Her foot slipped on the slick concrete, and she fell hard with a sharp cry of pain. For a brief, agonizing moment, David froze. His instincts screamed at him to move, but his mind fought back with the weight of what was at stake. If he stopped to help her, he would miss his shot. The meeting, the promotion, everything. If he walked away, he could still have a life he had worked so hard for. Then he heard her whimper, and he moved. David dropped his clipboard and ran to her side. The rain was freezing as it soaked through his clothes, but he barely noticed. He knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he checked her for injuries. Her breath came in shallow, painful gasps. "I think I broke my hip," she whispered, her voice thin against the storm. "It's okay, ma'am," David said. "I've got you." He pulled off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. He gave the dispatcher their location, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. He knew he was missing the meeting. He knew the consequences. But as he held the woman's hand, he also knew there was no other choice. The minutes dragged. The rain continued to pour. No one else came to help. Then came the sound of expensive boots splashing through puddles. David turned to see his supervisor, Rick Callahan, stomping toward him. Callahan's expression was a mask of fury. "What the hell are you doing, Langston?" Callahan barked. "You're supposed to be upstairs." "She fell," David said, rising slowly. "She's hurt. I called an ambulance." Callahan sneered. "Not your problem. Get your ass to that meeting. You think those execs are going to wait for someone like you?" David clenched his jaw, anger rising in his chest. She could have broken her hip. Callahan threw up his hands. "And you just threw away your shot at the promotion because of some old lady who wasn't watching where she was going." David didn't respond. He already knew what Callahan thought of him. He had seen it in the way Callahan promoted others who played golf with him on weekends, even when David outworked them every time. He had heard the veil comments. He had felt the weight of being invisible. "I'm staying with her," David said, his voice quiet but resolute. Callahan shook his head, scribbled something on his clipboard, and said, "You're fired." David took a deep breath, feeling the truth settle heavily in his chest. But when the paramedics arrived minutes later, he was still there, holding the elderly woman's hand, keeping her calm as they loaded her onto the stretcher. "You're a good man," she told him softly as they lifted her into the ambulance. David smiled faintly. "Just get better, ma'am." But as the ambulance drove away and he stood alone on the loading dock, David felt the cold realization of what he had lost. His job, his insurance, the steady paycheck that paid for his mother's dialysis treatments. It was all gone. Later, when David returned to the break room to plead with Callahan one last time, it was useless. Callahan laughed in his face. "You should have thought about that before you played hero," Callahan said, rolling his eyes. David walked home in the rain that night, feeling the weight of 12 years of work washed away by a single decision. The call that changed everything. David sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment, his head in his hands. His mother was asleep in the next room. She didn't know yet that he had lost his job, that their health insurance was gone, that he had no idea what to do next. Then his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it, but something told him to answer. "David Langston?" a woman's voice asked. "Yeah, this is David. My name is Evelyn Carter," she said smoothly. "I'm calling from Carter Global Enterprises. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning." David blinked. "Carter Global? I think you have the wrong person." "No mistake, Mr. Langston," she replied. "You're exactly who we're looking for. A car will pick you up at 8 a.m. Before David could respond, she hung up. The next morning, a black car arrived at his apartment building, right on time. David climbed in, still wondering if this was a mistake or a cruel joke. They drove downtown, past places he'd only ever seen on TV. Glass skyscrapers, polished marble lobbies, men and women in tailored suits. The car pulled into an underground garage. The driver opened the door, silent and professional. "They're waiting for you upstairs," he said. David was escorted to the top floor of Carter Global Enterprises, where he entered a sleek conference room. Standing at the head of the table was a man he recognized immediately. Ethan Carter. "You," David said, his voice flat. "Me," Ethan replied, smirking faintly. Before David could ask anything else, another voice spoke. "And me." David turned. It was the elderly woman he had helped. But she wasn't hunched over in pain now. She stood tall and dignified, exuding authority. She smiled softly. Surprised, David nodded slowly. "I don't even know what to think." Ethan gestured to a chair. "Sit. We have something to discuss." David did as he was told. Ethan leaned forward. "I run Northern Hall Logistics," Ethan said. "That warehouse. My company. Rick Callahan. He worked for me. After what I saw, and after what you did, he doesn't anymore." David's eyes widened. "You fired him?" "Immediately," Ethan replied. Margaret Carter, the woman he had helped, spoke next. "You lost your job helping me," she said. "You didn't have to. You knew what it would cost you. But you did it anyway. That tells me exactly the kind of man you are." David swallowed hard. Ethan slid a folder across the table. "We want you to run our new community outreach program," he said. "Full salary. 3 times what you made at the warehouse. Full benefits. Health care for your mother. In a new apartment closer to work." David stared at the folder. It was real. The contract. The salary. The opportunity. "Why me?" he asked, his voice breaking. Margaret smiled. "Because you saw me as a person when no one else did." With trembling hands, David picked up the pen and signed. A new beginning. 3 months later, David stood at the front of a conference room in a sharp navy suit. It still felt foreign, but it fit him now. "Welcome to Carter Community Outreach," David said, addressing a room of new hires. "We're here to change lives. Trust me, I know how much that matters." Through the glass, he saw his mother chatting with employees, laughing softly in a way he hadn't heard in years. Outside, the Chicago skyline stretched beyond the windows. And far in the distance, the old warehouse where he had spent 12 years of his life was barely a speck. But for David Langston, it wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning.